Welcome to League and Lore. The story you're about to hear are woven from the world of League of Legends, created by Riot Games. This video is a fan-made retelling, meant to explore and celebrate the lore of Runeterra. If you enjoy tales of ancient wars, fallen champions, and forgotten legends, consider subscribing, leaving a like, and ringing the notification bell, so you never miss a new story as it unfolds. Vayne, the Night Hunter, Chapter 1. The night that taught her what monsters look like. Vayne was not born a hunter. She was born into certainty. Her childhood unfolded within stone walls and inherited security. Wealth that insulated, status that reassured, parents who believed that civilization itself was a kind of armor. In their world, danger was regulated. Law functioned. The worst evils were distant rumors. Stories used to frighten children into obedience rather than truths to be confronted. Evil, they believed, was external. That belief died first. The creature that came for her family did not announce itself as a monster. It did not wear claws or roar in theatrical fury. It wore confidence. It moved like something that knew the world would not stop it in time. The precision of its violence was what terrified Vayne most. Not rage, but intent. This was not chaos. This was decision. She survived by hiding. From beneath the floorboards, she watched the world she trusted collapse with horrifying efficiency. Her parents were not foolish. They were not weak. They were simply unprepared for a threat that did not respect rules, walls, or pleas. The monster did not linger. It had no need to. It took what it came for and left silence behind. When the sun rose, it revealed a truth that would shape the rest of her life. No authority arrived in time. No justice followed immediately. The world did not correct itself. Vayne learned then that safety was not guaranteed by order. It was enforced by vigilance. Monsters did not need permission to exist. They thrived in the spaces where people assumed they could not. That night carved a vow into her deeper than grief ever could. She would never again be helpless. She would never again assume innocence. She would never again allow uncertainty to delay action. Grief did not soften her. It sharpened her. Vayne did not seek comfort in morning rituals or communal support. She sought competence. She studied anatomy, not to heal, but to end life efficiently. She trained her body into a tool that responded instantly, without hesitation or excess. Weapons became extensions of will rather than symbols of power. Emotion was dangerous. Emotion slowed judgment, so she learned to control it. Her path eventually led her to Demacia, a land whose ideology aligned disturbingly well with her emerging worldview. Demacia believed in clarity, in naming threats, in eradicating what endangered the whole. Magic was feared because it was unpredictable. Monsters were hunted because they violated order. Vayne agreed. Mostly. She joined Demacia not as a soldier, but as an instrument, a specialist deployed where others hesitated. She hunted demons, undead cursed beings, creatures that blurred the line between myth and reality. Her methods were efficient, unsentimental, and deeply unsettling to those who witnessed them. She did not interrogate her targets. She eliminated them. This made her effective beyond dispute. It also made her an anomaly. Vayne did not share Demacia's reverence for law as moral arbiter. She respected results, not process. If a threat was neutralized, the method was justified. If hesitation allowed danger to persist, hesitation was culpable. Demacia tolerated her because she delivered certainty in situations that threatened it. Others feared her because she asked questions Demacia preferred to avoid. What unsettled people most was not her violence. It was her refusal to believe in redemption. Vayne did not deny that monsters could once have been human. She simply believed that origin did not outweigh outcome. If something endangered others, it forfeited its right to consideration. This belief hardened with every hunt. Every demon slain reinforced her conviction that mercy was a gamble she could not afford. Every delay she witnessed in others, every council debate, every ritual consultation, felt like an invitation for catastrophe. Vayne came to see compassion, when extended to the dangerous, as negligence dressed up as virtue. And yet, the world resisted her simplicity. Some targets begged. Some remembered who they had been. Some hesitated before striking back. These moments forced a question Vayne refused to entertain. What if not all monsters chose what they became? She dismissed the thought immediately. Uncertainty had killed her family. She would not let it kill anyone else. Vayne's certainty became her shield and her prison. It protected her from doubt, but it also isolated her from nuance. She existed comfortably only in a world divided cleanly between hunter and prey, threat and safety. This worked, until the day it didn't, because Runeterra does not respect absolutes. Monsters wear many shapes, and Demacia itself would soon force Vayne to confront a truth more dangerous than any demon. Sometimes the line between monster and protector is drawn not by nature, but by belief. And belief, once weaponized, does not always stop where you intend. Chapter 2. When the monster would not stay named. Vayne did not notice the fracture when it first appeared. It arrived disguised as consistency. Her work had always relied on definition. A monster was something that preyed on the innocent, violated natural order, and refused restraint. Once identified, it was eliminated. This clarity had saved lives. It had saved her. Vayne believed in it with the quiet ferocity of someone who had tested the alternative and found it wanting. The problem was not that the world changed. The problem was that the world had always been more complex than her definitions allowed, and it was growing increasingly unwilling to stay quiet about it. The first cracks appeared in Demacia itself. Demacia prided itself on purity of purpose. It named threats decisively: magic, demons, creatures of the unnatural. This aligned with Vayne's instincts, until the kingdom's fear began to widen its reach. The definition of monster stretched, pulled by paranoia and policy, until it began to overlap with people. Vayne noticed but did not object. At first, mages, Demacia argued, were dangerous by nature. Uncontrolled power invited catastrophe. History proved it. Vayne understood this logic intimately. She had seen what unchecked power could do. She had lived through the cost of mercy extended too far. So when mage hunters intensified their efforts, Vayne did not interfere. She told herself this was not her hunt. She told herself she hunted monsters, not citizens. But the distinction grew harder to maintain. She encountered mages who had not to deceive, but to survive. She saw families torn apart not because of action, but potential. Children marked as threats before they could choose what they would become. These sights unsettled her. Not enough to stop her, but enough to disturb the neat alignment she had relied upon. The fracture widened further when Demacia itself shielded beings that fit her definition of monster, because they were useful. The most destabilizing example was Shyvana, a creature born of dragon fire and human will, a being who transformed into something undeniably monstrous, and yet fought loyally for Demacia. Shyvana was celebrated where others like her would have been hunted. She was protected by crown and command. Vayne did not trust her, not because Shyvana had done wrong, but because she could, and that, to Vayne, had always been enough. Demacia's defense of Shyvana forced a question Vayne had avoided. Was a monster defined by nature, by action, or by allegiance? If allegiance excused monstrosity, then her certainty collapsed into politics. If action defined it, then Demacia's treatment of mages became suspect. If nature defined it, then Shyvana's existence was an exception that undermined the rule. Vayne hated exceptions. Exceptions were how monsters survived scrutiny. Her discomfort hardened into action when she pursued targets beyond Demacia's borders. Creatures that hid among mortals, fed quietly, left no obvious trail. It was on one such hunt that she crossed paths with something far worse than ambiguity. Evelyn. Evelyn did not masquerade as human to survive. She did so to enjoy. The demon preyed on suffering itself, manipulating desire and pain until victims offered themselves willingly. Evelyn was everything Vayne believed monsters truly were: intentional, predatory, irredeemable. Their encounters were brief, violent, and inconclusive. Evelyn escaped repeatedly, not because Vayne lacked skill, but because cruelty adapted faster than certainty. This failure shook her more deeply than she admitted. For the first time, a monster existed that validated her worldview completely, and still evaded her. The hunt became obsession. The line between discipline and fixation blurred. Vayne began pushing herself further, isolating more completely, allowing nothing to interrupt the pursuit. Demetia grew uneasy. Vayne was no longer simply eliminating threats. She was defining them independently. She ignored orders when they conflicted with her judgment. She pursued targets without sanction. She treated hesitation as liability, even when it came from the institutions that had once empowered her. The moral fracture was now visible. Vayne no longer trusted systems to define monsters correctly. She trusted only herself. This placed her in a dangerous position. Without oversight, without reflection, her certainty risked becoming the very thing she hunted. Demetia had once been her framework. Now it was merely a resource, useful when aligned, ignorable when not. And still, she did not see herself as compromised. She saw herself as necessary. The tragedy of Vayne's arc is not that she is wrong about monsters. It is that she is right often enough to justify never questioning herself again. Her story does not descend into villainy. It narrows. It sharpens. It becomes increasingly precise and increasingly lonely. She remains effective. She remains feared. She remains convinced that doubt kills faster than conviction. But the fracture remains. Because in a world where monsters can wear loyalty and innocence can be condemned by fear, the question Vayne refuses to answer grows louder with every hunt. What happens when certainty becomes indistinguishable from cruelty, and the hunter no longer recognizes the difference? Chapter 3. The Hunter Who Looked Back. Vayne had always believed that monsters revealed themselves under pressure. Corner them, threaten them, strip away pretense. Eventually, something inhuman would surface: fangs, claws, magic, hunger. That belief had guided her blade and bolt for years. It had kept her moving forward, decisive and unburdened by doubt. This is where that belief begins to fail her. The fracture that formed in Demetia during her earlier hunts does not widen through rebellion or betrayal, but through repetition. Vayne continues doing exactly what she has always done: tracking, hunting, eliminating. The difference is not in her actions, but in what she notices while performing them. Her targets are changing, not in form. Demons still stalk the night, cursed beings still hide among ruins, but in context. Increasingly, the monsters she hunts are bound to systems larger than themselves. A possessed soldier abandoned by command. A mage warped by fear after years of hiding. A creature born not of malice, but of prolonged desperation. Vayne kills them anyway, but the certainty no longer comes afterward. One hunt in particular lingers. A beast had been terrorizing a border settlement, swift, brutal, unmistakably unnatural. Vayne tracked it efficiently, cornered it in a ruined chapel, and struck without hesitation. As it died, the magic binding it unraveled, and what remained was not triumph, but recognition. The creature had once been a man, not long ago. His transformation was incomplete, uneven, as though he had been caught halfway between fear and surrender. The villagers thanked her. They always did. And yet, as Vayne left, she found no satisfaction in their relief. The pattern disturbed her. The monster had not chosen predation in the way Evelyn did. It had reacted, adapted, broken under pressure. This did not excuse it, but it complicated it. Vayne does not stop hunting after this realization. Canonically, she never does. What changes is her internal posture. She begins observing more closely, listening to final words, studying environments, noting how often Demetian fear precedes monstrosity rather than follows it. This awareness does not soften her. It sharpens her anger. If monsters are being made, then someone is responsible. Her suspicion turns inward, toward Demetia's institutions, toward the mage seekers, toward the quiet policies that trade long-term harm for short-term order. Vayne does not align herself with rebellion. She does not sympathize openly with mages, but she begins to distrust authority as deeply as she distrusts mercy. This places her in dangerous territory. Vayne's defining trait has always been autonomy. She obeys Demetia when Demetia aligns with her purpose. Now that alignment fractures. Orders come that she delays. Targets are assigned that she verifies independently. She begins operating at the edges of Demetia's approval, not as outlaw, but as liability. Her superiors notice. So do her enemies. It is during this period that her fixation on Evelyn deepens. Evelyn represents everything Vayne wants the world to be simple about: intentional cruelty, predation for pleasure, irredeemable evil. Each failed encounter reinforces Vayne's fear that hesitation enables monsters like her to persist. Evelyn becomes proof, at least in Vayne's mind. That doubt is dangerous. This is the tension that defines Chapter 3. Vayne stands between two unbearable conclusions. If monsters are always monsters, then Damasia's excesses are justified. If monsters are sometimes created, then Vayne herself is enforcing a broken system. She cannot accept either fully, so she doubles down. Vayne becomes more isolated, more selective, more lethal. She limits attachments, refuses counsel, and narrows her focus to threats she believes no one else will confront properly. Her identity as the hunter becomes less about protection and more about control. Control over chaos, over narrative, over uncertainty. Canon does not depict Vayne questioning whether she is wrong. It depicts her questioning whether anyone else can be trusted to be right. Vayne has not fallen, nor has she turned against Demacia. She has simply stepped out of alignment with it, operating parallel to authority rather than beneath it. She remains effective, feared, and indispensable. But she is no longer certain that killing monsters is enough. Only that stopping would be worse. Chapter 4, Evelyn, or the Price of Looking Too Closely. Vayne had hunted many demons, but none of them had ever watched her hunt back. Evelyn did. From the moment Vayne realized that Evelyn was not simply evading her, but studying her, the hunt changed its nature. This was not a creature fleeing extermination. This was a predator allowing pursuit, savoring anticipation the way others savored victory. Evelyn fed on suffering, but not only physical pain. She fed on fixation, on longing sharpened into obsession. And Vayne was becoming exquisite. Each failed encounter left Vayne angrier, not because Evelyn had escaped, but because the demon had done so on purpose. Clues were left too cleanly. Witnesses survived too conveniently. Corpses were arranged in ways that felt deliberate, as though Evelyn were sculpting a narrative for Vayne to follow. Vayne told herself this changed nothing. She hunted monsters. Evelyn was a monster. The rest was noise. But obsession has a way of masquerading as discipline. Vayne began anticipating Evelyn's movements rather than responding to them. She memorized patterns of despair, where grief fermented longest, where desire curdled into vulnerability. She studied not only demonology, but human psychology, mapping the emotional ecosystems Evelyn favored. The more Vayne learned, the more she realized something deeply unsettling. Evelyn did not create suffering. She curated it. The demon selected victims already primed by neglect, isolation, or shame. Evelyn thrived where systems had failed, where authority had withdrawn, where compassion had been rationed, where silence replaced care. In those places, Evelyn did not need to force pain. She only needed to arrive. This realization threatened Vayne's worldview more than any plea for mercy ever had. If Evelyn's power depended on existing suffering, then killing the demon without addressing the conditions that fed her would be temporary at best. Another would take her place. The hunt would never end. Vayne rejected this conclusion immediately. Systems were slow. Monsters were immediate. She could not dismantle the world. She could only remove its predators. Evelyn sensed the conflict in her long before Vayne admitted it to herself. Their encounters became more intimate, more theatrical. Evelyn spoke during them, not to taunt, but to mirror. She named Vayne's certainty, her refusal to doubt, her need for control. She framed Vayne's hatred as devotion, her discipline as fixation. "You hunt me because I'm honest," Evelyn purred during one confrontation. "You and I don't pretend." The words enraged Vayne, because they were not entirely false. Vayne did not deny her hatred. She did not deny that killing Evelyn would feel personal. What unsettled her was the implication that her pursuit had crossed a threshold, from duty into need. She adjusted tactics ruthlessly. Vayne narrowed her world until Evelyn occupied most of it. She turned down other hunts. She ignored Demacian requests that did not align with her goal. She pushed her body past exhaustion, trusting muscle memory and will to compensate for sleep and reflection. The result was effectiveness and vulnerability. Evelyn exploited this expertly. She vanished for long stretches, forcing Vayne to confront the emptiness left behind. Then she resurfaced suddenly, triggering frantic response. The rhythm trained Vayne into reaction rather than judgment. This was the cost of obsession, not loss of control, but distortion of priority. Vayne eventually cornered Evelyn, not through brilliance, but through attrition. The fight was brutal, close, and unfinished. Evelyn escaped again, wounded but delighted. "You almost caught me," the demon whispered. "Do you know why that frightened me?" Vayne did not answer. because you weren't thinking about anyone else. The words lingered longer than the wound. In the aftermath, Vayne realized what Evelyn had taken from her. Not blood, not advantage, but proportion. The hunt had consumed space meant for judgment, for context, for questioning whether fixation itself was becoming a kind of vulnerability. Vayne did not abandon the hunt, but she changed how she carried it. She resumed other hunts. She forced herself to widen her focus. She accepted that Evelyn would not be eradicated quickly or cleanly. The demon was not a test of strength. She was a test of restraint. Vayne learned this lesson imperfectly, painfully, and without absolution. Her obsession did not vanish. It stabilized, contained, but always pressing. Evelyn remained out there, feeding, waiting, watching. And Vayne understood, at last, the most dangerous truth of all. Some monsters do not need to defeat you. They only need you to forget everything else. Chapter 5. When Demacia looked at the blade it had forged. Vayne had never concerned herself with how Demacia perceived her. Perception was for politics. She dealt in outcomes. For years, that had been enough. Demacia tolerated, then relied upon her methods because they delivered certainty in moments when the kingdom's ideology strained under threat. She hunted what others feared to name. She went where law hesitated. She removed problems before they demanded explanation. But systems do not tolerate autonomy forever, especially not when autonomy begins to reveal their contradictions. Demacia's gaze did not turn on Vayne suddenly. It narrowed first. Reports were delayed. Requests for clarification followed successful hunts. Commanders asked for justification where they had once accepted results. Oversight crept in under the language of coordination and safety. Vayne noticed immediately. She did not bristle. She adjusted. But the adjustment itself drew attention. Vayne had begun verifying targets independently, cross-checking intelligence, refusing hunts that felt politically motivated rather than necessary. She did not announce this shift. She simply acted as though Demacia's authority was advisory rather than absolute. This was unacceptable. To Demacia, order was not merely structure. It was identity. A weapon that answered only to itself, no matter how effective, threatened the narrative that control equaled virtue. Vayne was no longer just a hunter. She was a variable. The mage seekers, in particular, grew wary. They had built their mandate on clarity. Magic was dangerous, therefore controlled. Threats were named, therefore eliminated. Vayne's growing insistence on contextual judgment disrupted that clarity. Worse, her refusal to condemn beings like Shyvana outright exposed a hypocrisy Demacia preferred to ignore. If Shyvana could be celebrated despite her monstrous form, then Vayne's definition of monster, based on threat rather than nature, was more consistent than Demacia's own. That consistency was dangerous. Demacia's response was subtle. No arrest. No confrontation. Instead, Vayne found her movements increasingly observed. Escorts assigned without request. Missions framed narrowly, with incomplete information. The kingdom sought not to stop her, but to contain her, to fold her back into the narrative as tool rather than agent. Vayne did not comply. She continued operating beyond sanctioned boundaries, hunting demons and creatures Demacia either could not reach or preferred not to acknowledge. Each success embarrassed the institutions meant to control such threats. Each refusal sharpened suspicion. The irony was not lost on her. Demacia feared her not because she was monstrous, but because she was independent. The tension came to a head during a hunt that should never have been assigned. Intelligence identified a suspected monster operating within Demacian territory. Quiet, subtle, feeding slowly. Vayne was ordered to eliminate it immediately. The report was clean. Too clean. She investigated anyway. The truth was damning. The target was not a demon, but a frightened mage hiding within a community that had protected them out of necessity rather than ideology. The magic involved was uncontrolled, yes, but reactive, not predatory. Fear, not malice, was the driving force. Demacia had labeled them monster for convenience. Vayne stood at a crossroads she had avoided for years. Killing the mage would satisfy the order and preserve her standing. Refusing would confirm every fear Demacia harbored about her autonomy. There was no outcome that preserved alignment. She chose refusal. Not rebellion. Not defiance. Refusal. She did not announce it. She did not make spectacle. She simply did not complete the hunt. Instead, she ensured the mage fled beyond Demacia's reach, away from structures that would force transformation through fear. Demacia noticed immediately. The response was swift, though still restrained. Vayne was summoned, not to be punished, but to be questioned. Her superiors spoke in measured tones about loyalty, mandate, and risk. They framed her refusal as emotional compromise rather than ethical judgment. Vayne listened. Then she spoke plainly. "If you want monsters," she said, "make them yourselves. I won't help." It was the first time she had openly challenged Demasia's moral authority. The room went quiet. Demacia did not strip her of rank. It did not imprison her. Instead, it did something far more revealing. It distanced itself. Vayne was reassigned, sidelined, deployed only where her actions could be anticipated and controlled. She was still useful, but no longer trusted. Vayne left soon after. Not as exile, not as fugitive, but as something more dangerous. A hunter no longer bound by a single banner. Demacia had not cast her out. It had failed to contain her. This was the final fracture. Vayne remained what she had always been, a monster hunter, but now her criteria were her own. She no longer pretended that institutions would define threat correctly. She would continue hunting demons, undead predators like Evelyn. But she would no longer serve fear dressed as law. Demacia had forged her to enforce certainty. In the end, what frightened them most was that she had learned to question it, and she carried that question with her into the wider world, where monsters waited, and so did systems far less honest about the damage they caused. Chapter 6. The Hunter Without a Kingdom. Vayne did not announce her departure from Demacia. She simply stopped returning. There was no pursuit, no declaration of treason. Demacia did not brand her outlaw because doing so would have required acknowledging why she had left. And Demacia had learned, painfully, that naming certain fractures only widened them. Instead, the kingdom allowed her to drift beyond its borders, reclassifying her absence as independent operation, then quietly as former asset. It was a lie that preserved order. Vayne understood this immediately. A hunter without a kingdom was more dangerous than a traitor. She could no longer be predicted, redirected, or absolved through institutional framing. Her actions would now stand alone, stripped of banner and justification. Every kill would belong to her. She accepted the cost. Without Demacia's resources, Vayne's hunts became harder, slower, and more isolating. Intelligence no longer arrived pre-filtered. Supplies had to be earned, traded for, or taken from the remnants of ruined places. She learned to navigate territories where authority was fractured or openly hostile. Borderlands, war-scarred towns, forgotten paths where monsters thrived precisely because no one claimed responsibility there. This suited her. Vayne had never trusted centralized protection. Now she operated in spaces where protection had never existed at all. Her criteria for monsters sharpened further. Not because she softened, but because she could no longer afford waste. Every hunt carried risk. Every decision mattered. She targeted beings whose continued existence would compound harm. Demons feeding on despair, undead bound to cycles of violence, creatures who could not, or would not, restrain themselves. She did not hunt out of ideology. She hunted out of necessity. And yet something had changed. Without Demacia's shadow, Vayne was forced to confront the full consequences of her choices. There were no councils to absorb blame, no orders to deflect responsibility. Villagers looked at her not as sanctioned protector, but as stranger armed with lethal certainty. Gratitude was quieter. Fear was more honest. She found that she preferred this. Truth, when unmediated, was easier to read. Her path crossed rumors of Evelyn again. Always just out of reach. Always in places where suffering had been allowed to ferment unchecked. Evelyn's presence marked the failures of multiple systems at once. Neglect, repression, silence. Vayne recognized the pattern now with unsettling clarity. Evelyn did not hide from authority. She hid where authority had already failed. The realization reinforced Vayne's decision to remain unaligned. Kingdoms hunted symbols. She hunted outcomes. Where rulers debated jurisdiction, she tracked pain. Where laws hesitated, she acted. This made her indispensable and ungovernable. Over time, stories spread, not of a Demacian hunter, but of a woman who arrived without allegiance and left without explanation. Some called her savior. Others called her executioner. Most agreed on one thing. When she appeared, something dangerous ended. Vayne did not correct the stories. Reputation was a tool like any other. She encountered others like herself, mercenaries, outcasts, former soldiers disillusioned with banners that failed them. Some offered partnership. Vayne refused most. Cooperation invited compromise, and compromise blurred judgment. When she did work alongside others, it was brief and transactional, bounded tightly by shared objective. Trust, she believed, was a luxury monsters exploited. And yet, solitude pressed in more heavily now. Without Demasia's structure, however flawed, Vayne was forced to define her own limits. Exhaustion was no longer balanced by relief. Doubt, once suppressed by certainty of mandate, surfaced unexpectedly. She did not question what she did. She questioned how long she could do it alone. This was the quiet tension of her new life. Freedom purchased at the cost of endurance. A hunter without a kingdom had no rest beyond what she claimed herself. No absolution beyond results. No future beyond the next threat neutralized. Still, Vayne did not turn back. Demacia had taught her how to hunt monsters. Leaving Demacia had taught her how easily kingdoms became something else. She walked on, crossbow ready, senses sharpened, certainty narrowed but unbroken. The world beyond banners was darker, less orderly, and far more honest about the cost of survival. And in that world, monsters did not care whose laws you served, only whether you stopped them. Chapter 7. Necessary Evil. Vayne first realized she had become something feared when people began locking their doors for her as quickly as they did for the monsters she hunted. It was not hatred. Hatred was loud, defiant, emotional. This was quieter, more practical. Villagers lowered their voices when she entered. Inns hesitated before offering a room. Eyes followed her movements with the same wary calculation reserved for storms or wildfire. Forces that could save you or ruin you, depending on how close you stood. Vayne noticed. She did not correct it. Fear, she had learned, was information. The irony was bitter. The safer a place became after her departure, the more uneasy people felt about the cost. Monsters died cleanly under her bolts, but the aftermath was rarely simple. Sometimes the creature had been the only thing keeping worse forces at bay. Sometimes its death exposed truths communities had buried. Sometimes people realized, too late, that the monster had been a symptom, and that removing it did not absolve them of responsibility. Vayne did not stay to help them process this. She never had. Her role was removal, not repair. And yet, the line between necessary and excessive began to blur. Not in her actions, but in how others framed them. Word spread of a hunter who did not ask permission, who judged independently, who killed without trial. In lands accustomed to fragile authority, that independence looked uncomfortably like tyranny. Some rulers tried to recruit her. Others tried to ban her. Neither approach succeeded. Vayne did not recognize their legitimacy over her work. She respected capability, not crown. Where leaders protected their people effectively, she left them alone. Where they hesitated, concealed, or sacrificed the vulnerable for order, she intervened without announcement. This pattern earned her a reputation that unsettled everyone. She was not hero. She was not villain. She was contingency. And contingencies frightened systems built on predictability. The tension crystallized during a hunt that should have been straightforward. A demon had been feeding in a border town. Nothing subtle, nothing redeemable. Vayne tracked it efficiently, eliminated it publicly, and prepared to leave. Instead of gratitude, she was met with accusation. The town's leaders demanded accountability, not for the demon's actions, but for hers. They wanted justification, explanation, proof of authority. They were not defending the monster. They were defending their right to decide who wielded violence in their domain. Vayne listened. Then she left. The demon did not return. The town remained divided. That, she realized, was the true cost of being necessary without being legitimate. When violence solves problems faster than institutions can, it exposes their weakness. And people resent the exposure as much as the weakness itself. Vayne became aware that she was increasingly treated as a final measure rather than a solution. Communities endured suffering longer, hoping problems would resolve internally, because calling her meant surrendering moral control. By the time she arrived, the damage was often irreversible. This infuriated her, not because they doubted her, but because hesitation had once again cost lives. Her obsession with Evelyn sharpened in this context. Evelyn thrived precisely in these gaps, where people delayed, debated, rationalized. Evelyn did not need chaos. She needed indecision. Every time Vayne arrived too late, every time fear of the hunter outweighed fear of the monster, Evelyn fed. The realization was corrosive. Vayne began to question whether her reputation itself was enabling the very evil she sought to eradicate. If people feared her judgment more than demonic predation, then something had inverted catastrophically. She had become deterrent not just to monsters, but to intervention. This did not soften her methods. It hardened her resolve. Vayne concluded that legitimacy was irrelevant if survival was at stake. History, she believed, would not remember who followed process, only who stopped the threat. If fear of her presence forced people to confront danger themselves, so be it. If it delayed action, she would act anyway. Necessary evil, she accepted, was still necessary. She did not seek to correct her image. She did not defend herself. She allowed stories to darken, believing that fear directed outward was preferable to fear turned inward and suppressed. Better to be the monster people blamed than the silence monsters fed on. Still, the cost accumulated. Isolation deepened. Trust evaporated. Even allies approached her cautiously, aware that her moral framework left little room for negotiation. Vayne felt this acutely, but she refused to let loneliness dictate restraint. Restraint, she believed, was how monsters survived. By the end of this chapter of her life, Vayne stood where few could, unaligned, feared, effective, and increasingly singular. She had become what the world turned to when everything else failed, and what it distanced itself from the moment the crisis passed. She understood, with cold clarity, that this path offered no peace. But peace had never saved anyone. And so she walked on, into darker places, harder choices, and a future where the question was no longer whether monsters existed, but whether the world could endure the kind of protector required to stop them. Chapter 8. The Silence After the Bolt. Vayne did not believe in endings. Endings implied completion, and completion implied safety. The kind of safety she had learned, too young and too violently, was an illusion. Monsters did not end. Fear did not end. At best, they were interrupted, pushed back into shadow until someone looked away. So Vayne lived in interruption. Vayne's story is not marked by triumph or defeat, but by continuation under tension. She moves through Runeterra without banner or permission, her name preceding her in fragments. A woman with a crossbow, a shadow that hunts shadows, a protector who never stays long enough to be thanked. She remains what she has always been, effective. But effectiveness no longer brings clarity. Her pursuit of Evelyn never resolves. Their encounters thin, stretch across regions, lose the intimacy of obsession without ever dissolving. Evelyn adapts, as she always does, feeding in subtler places, on quieter suffering, where intervention is harder to justify and easier to delay. Vayne recognizes the pattern. She also recognizes the limit of her reach. For all her discipline, she cannot be everywhere. For all her certainty, she cannot prevent systems from failing in the same ways that birthed the monsters she hunts. This knowledge does not paralyze her, but it erodes the illusion that vigilance alone is enough. She does not become merciful. She becomes precise. Vayne learns when not to shoot, not because she believes in redemption, but because she learns to distinguish between threat and potential, to recognize when killing would merely replace one horror with another. This does not make her gentler. It makes her quieter. Her presence leaves fewer traces, fewer stories, fewer bodies that invite argument. Some interpret this as growth. Others see it as concealment. Vayne does not correct them. Her relationship to Demacia remains unresolved. She never returns openly, but neither does she sever herself from its fate. When demons cross its borders, they still die. When atrocities threaten its people, they are still stopped. Demacia benefits from her protection without acknowledging it, and perhaps that is the only way it can. She has become something Demacia cannot claim and cannot discard. A shadow that refuses exile. Vayne's isolation deepens, but it does not hollow her. She no longer measures her worth by recognition or belonging. Her identity has narrowed to function, yes, but also to choice. Each hunt is deliberate. Each kill weighed not against mercy, but against consequence. This is the quiet evolution of her arc. She does not soften. She does not repent. She does not fall. She adapts. The world continues to argue about what she is. Hero, monster, necessary evil. Vayne understands that the argument itself is proof of her relevance. A world comfortable with its protectors is a world lying to itself. If people fear her, then they are at least honest about the cost of survival. On some nights, when the hunt pauses and silence stretches too long, Vayne remembers the girl she was. The child who hid and learned that monsters moved with purpose. She does not mourn that girl. She honors her by ensuring that someone somewhere always stands between innocence and inevitability. Vayne walks on, crossbow loaded, judgment intact, certainty sharpened but no longer absolute. Her story does not end because Runeterra does not allow such luxury. As long as monsters exist, and as long as systems continue to fail, there will be those who step into the dark without asking permission. Vayne is one of them, and whether that makes her savior or threat is a question the world will continue to debate, long after she has already moved on to the next hunt. That's today's story from Runeterra. If you enjoyed the lore, consider liking the video and subscribing for more tales from League of Legends. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.